Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, do any old papers rest in a drawer of yours kept long past the reading? Watson once sat snowbound in a judge's library, watching how a single altered page could outlast 15 years of silence. He learned that ink does not forget even when memory does. Do subscribe so no page goes unexamined. Now settle by the lamp. For as Holmes held, the truth, once written, cannot be wholly erased. Find us on Watson's Margins on Spotify, link below. Chapter 1. The Snow at Blackthorn Hall. It has often seemed to me, in setting down these records of my friend Sherlock Holmes's career, that the most singular cases were those which began not with violence, but with silence. Of all the winters I passed in his company, none impressed itself upon my memory so vividly as that of 1896, when a letter bearing the seal of a retired judge drew us from the comfortable fog of Baker Street into the white and merciless solitude of the Yorkshire moors. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, while Holmes sat cross-legged upon the hearthrug, engaged in the delicate business of separating a quantity of cigar ash into labelled envelopes for his growing monograph. He read it twice, then passed it across to me without comment. "Sir Edmund Vale," I said, glancing at the signature. "The name is familiar, though I cannot place it." "You would remember him better as Mr. Justice Vale," said Holmes, "who presided over the Crow trial some 15 years ago. A financial scandal, Watson, of the sort that fills newspaper columns for a season and is then forgotten by all but the man who was ruined by it. Sir Edmund writes that his health is failing, and that before he surrenders his papers to the Crown Archives, he wishes to review them once more. He asks that I come to Blackthorn Hall at my earliest convenience, and hints, in the careful language of a man long accustomed to weighing his words, that something in the old Transcript has troubled him. A judge, troubled by his own verdict. Just so, and a judge, Watson, does not send for a consulting detective merely to ease his conscience. There is something concrete beneath the sentiment. We shall go tomorrow. We travelled north through a country already hardening under an early and bitter winter, and by the time our train had deposited us at the small station nearest Blackthorn Hall, the sky had taken on that leaden, waiting quality which any countryman will tell you precedes a heavy fall of snow. Sir Edmund's carriage met us upon the platform, and as we drove the 4 miles to the house, the first flakes began to descend, gentle and deliberate, as though rehearsing for some greater performance to come. Blackthorn Hall proved to be a long grey house of considerable age, set upon a rise above a fold of the moor, with mullioned windows that glowed amber against the gathering dusk. Sir Edmund himself received us in the hall, a tall man, stooped now with age and illness, but retaining in his eye that keen, unforgiving quality which I imagine had served him well upon the bench. He grasped Holmes's hand with more strength than I had expected. "You're very good to come, Mr. Holmes, and at such short notice," said he. "I fear I have brought you into rather uncomfortable circumstances. The glass has been falling since morning, and my man tells me the roads to the village will be impassable by nightfall." "I have not come for the climate, Sir Edmund," Holmes replied, with the ghost of a smile, "but for the matter you were good enough to describe in outline in your letter. We shall speak of it after dinner. I confess I would rather my household did not hear the particulars discussed at length. You will meet them presently." The household, as I came to know it over the course of that evening, was a small one, and outwardly as respectable a gathering as one might find in the length and breadth of England. There was Miss Eleanor Vale, the judge's niece, a composed and handsome woman of perhaps 30 years, who acted as her uncle's secretary and seemed to watch over him with a devotion that did her credit. There was Colonel Hugh Meredith, a soldierly man with a grey moustache and the abrupt manner of the parade ground, who had served, I learned, upon the jury of the very trial now under discussion. There was Dr. Lionel Harcourt, Sir Edmund's physician, and an old friend of the family, a stout and genial man whose profession had not dulled his taste for good wine. There was Mr. Adrian Bell, a solicitor engaged to set the judge's papers in order before their removal to London, a quiet, watchful young man with the pallor of one who spends more hours among documents than in the open air. There was the Reverend Samuel Price, the local clergyman, who had arrived that very afternoon to discuss some charitable trust, and now found himself, like ourselves, a prisoner of the weather. And presiding over the material comfort of us all was Thomas Greeley, the butler, an old and faithful servant who had, Sir Edmund told me, been 30 years in the family's employ. Dinner passed pleasantly enough, the conversation turning upon matters of no great consequence, until the cloth was drawn and the servants withdrawn, when Sir Edmund, with the manner of a man coming at last to unpleasant business, laid his hand upon the table. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I am an old lawyer, and I do not frighten easily at shadows, but I have found, in a document I have read 100 times, words that I am certain were never spoken in my court." Holmes leaned forward, his indifference gone in an instant. "Pray be precise, Sir Edmund. What words, and where?" "In the transcript of the trial of Nathaniel Crowe. Certain sentences in the testimony of Arthur Fenwick, sentences that were decisive in securing the conviction. I do not remember hearing them at all. And yet there they stand upon the printed page with every appearance of authenticity. You will permit me to examine the volume tomorrow morning?" "Of course. It lies now in my library, in the cabinet where it has rested undisturbed these 10 years, awaiting collection by the Crown Archivists once the roads permit." We retired not long afterward, the storm already rattling at the casements with a persistence that promised a long confinement. But as we crossed the hall toward the staircase, Holmes paused before the library door, and stooping, examined with close attention a narrow trail of melting snow upon the polished boards. A trifling thing, I thought, tracked in, no doubt, by some servant's boot. "I see nothing remarkable in it," I ventured. "Do you not?" said he, straightening slowly, his eyes still upon the darkening patch of water. "Snow, Watson, is an admirable witness. It has the virtue of being incapable of politeness." He said no more, and we went up together to our rooms, while outside the storm settled itself, like some great grey beast, upon the whole of Blackthorn Hall. Chapter 2. The Case of Nathaniel Crowe. I woke to a world made strange. The window of my chamber, when I drew back the curtain, showed nothing but a featureless white, the moor and the drive and the very hedges swallowed beneath a night's heavy snowfall, and the sky above so low and grey that it seemed almost to rest upon the chimney-pots. There would be no reaching the village that day, nor I suspected for several days to come. I found Holmes already at breakfast, and in a mood I knew well, that quiet, contained eagerness which came upon him whenever a problem promised to reward close attention. Sir Edmund joined us shortly, looking, I thought, somewhat improved by a night's rest, and it was over the coffee that he began, at Holmes's request, to unfold the history of the case that had brought us to his door. "Nathaniel Crowe," said he, "was in his day one of the most trusted names on the Stock Exchange. A man of considerable charm, Mr. Holmes, and considerable ambition, which is not always a fortunate combination. He was tried before me in the winter of '81, upon charges of fraudulent manipulation of railway shares, a scheme, if the prosecution was to be believed, that had beggared a score of respectable investors and enriched Crowe himself by many thousands of pounds." "And the verdict rested chiefly upon what evidence?" asked Holmes. "Upon the testimony of his own business partner, Arthur Fenwick, who swore that Crowe had personally ordered the destruction of certain ledgers which, had they survived, must have shown the true state of the company's affairs. Fenwick's evidence was damning, Mr. Holmes. It was also, I may say, very nearly the whole of the Crown's case. Crowe was convicted and died in prison 3 years later, protesting his innocence to the last, as I believe most convicted men do." "Most," said Holmes dryly, "but not all. Pray continue." The transcript of that trial has lain in my library cabinet since my retirement, locked away, and, I confess, seldom disturbed, for a judge does not care to reread his own failures, even when he believes them to have been just. But with the papers now to be surrendered to the Crown Archives, I thought it proper to review the volume once more, if only to satisfy myself that all was in order. Sir Edmund paused, and I saw his fingers tighten upon the handle of his cup. It was while rereading Fenwick's testimony that I came upon several sentences, accusations that Crowe had personally threatened him should he refuse to falsify the accounts, which I am now certain were never spoken in my court. I have presided over a great many trials, Mr. Holmes, and I flatter myself that my memory for the substance of evidence has not entirely failed me. You are quite certain, said Holmes, and not merely troubled by the ordinary erosions of time. I have gone over it 100 times. The words are not mine, nor Fenwick's, nor any man's who stood in that courtroom. Yet there they are, printed as plainly as the rest, with every mark of official authenticity. Holmes asked to see the volume without further delay, and we adjourned to the library, a long, handsome room lined with legal calf and lit, even at that hour, by a fire built high against the general chill. Sir Edmund unlocked a tall mahogany cabinet and drew forth a thick, leather-bound book, which he laid upon the desk with the particular reverence a man reserves for something that has troubled his sleep. Holmes examined it with the minute and unhurried attention I had seen him bestow upon 100 lesser objects. He turned the pages slowly, held certain leaves to the light, and ran his fingers along the spine as a physician might feel for a hidden fracture. The binding is old, he observed, half to himself. The pages uniformly toned, the court stamps present, and, so far as I can tell without a glass, genuine. Mr. Bell, for the solicitor had entered behind us, drawn by curiosity or duty. Can you confirm that this volume has remained continuously in Sir Edmund's possession? I can, Mr. Holmes, said Bell readily. I have had occasion to consult it myself upon 2 or 3 occasions this past fortnight, in the course of arranging Sir Edmund's papers for removal. It has not left this house in all the years I have known the family. Holmes nodded, but I observed that his examination didn't cease. He held the book at an angle to the firelight and remarked, almost carelessly, that one group of pages lay a shade higher than its neighbours when the volume was closed, a matter, he said, of perhaps the thickness of a visiting card. He noted also a single thread in the binding, whose colour seemed a fraction brighter than the surrounding stitching, and bending a leaf near Fenwick's testimony gently between finger and thumb, remarked upon a stiffness in the paper that its neighbours did not share. Bell, examining the same pages over Holmes's shoulder, smiled and shook his head. Forgive me, Mr. Holmes, but I confess I see nothing there beyond the ordinary wear of age. Paper does not season evenly through a book, particularly one so old. Perhaps not, said Holmes, and said no more upon the subject, though I knew that look of his too well to suppose the matter closed. He spent the remainder of the morning in quiet conversation with the members of the household, each of whom furnished, without apparent reluctance, an account of their movements of the previous days. Colonel Meredith had walked to the home farm and back before the snow closed in. Dr. Harcourt had attended a patient in the village on the Monday. Eleanor Vale had been occupied with her uncle's correspondence. Reverend Price had come only that Tuesday afternoon upon the business of his trust. None showed the smallest sign of unease, and Holmes, listening to each in turn with an attention that seemed almost wasted upon such unpromising material, wore by luncheon an expression I can only describe as disappointed. It was not until the evening, as we sat once more before the library fire, that the case took on a sharper edge. Sir Edmund, filling his pipe, remarked that he intended, before retiring, to compare the transcript against a second document, the original handwritten notes taken by the court clerk during the trial itself, preserved, sealed, in the same cabinet these 15 years. They have never been opened, said he, for there seemed no occasion. But if the transcript has indeed been tampered with, The clerk's own notes would settle the question beyond dispute. Holmes's whole manner changed in an instant, as a hound's will change at the first true scent. "Then I suggest, Sir Edmund, that you examine them tonight." The old judge smiled indulgently, as one humouring a younger man's excessive zeal. "Surely tomorrow will do, Mr. Holmes. It is late, and I confess to some fatigue." Holmes did not press the point again, but I, who had learned to read his silences almost as readily as his words, saw that he watched the cabinet door for a long moment after Sir Edmund had risen, and that whatever thought lay behind that steady gaze, it was not one that gave him comfort. Chapter 3. The Locked Library. I was roused a little after 7 the following morning by a sound I've heard too often in the course of my association with Sherlock Holmes to mistake for anything but trouble. A sharp cry, followed by the hurried tread of feet upon a staircase. I dressed hastily and came down to find the household already gathered before the library door, Sir Edmund at their centre, his dressing gown clutched about him, and his face the colour of the ash. "The cabinet," said he, before I had well reached the bottom stair. "Mr. Holmes, the cabinet has been disturbed." Holmes was already past him and into the room. I followed, and saw at once what had brought the old man to such a pitch of agitation. The library stood precisely as I remembered it from the night before, the fire long dead in the grate, the curtains drawn close against the white morning light, and yet the cabinet door stood ajar, and within it, where the sealed packet of the clerk's notes had lain beside the great transcript, there was now only the transcript itself. The packet had vanished entirely. "The door," said Holmes sharply. "Who locked it, and when?" It was Greeley, the old butler, who answered, his voice steady despite a certain pallor about the mouth. "I locked the library myself, sir, at 11 o'clock precisely, as is my custom, and carried the key directly to Sir Edmund's room, as he had bidden me." "And the key remained with you, Sir Edmund, through the night?" "Upon the table beside my bed, Mr. Holmes, where I might have reached it in the dark without rising. I did not stir from my room until Greeley knocked this morning." Holmes crossed at once to the windows, drew back the heavy curtains, and threw up the sash of the nearest with a motion that admitted a flood of bitter air and a scattering of fine snow across the sill. Beyond lay the side lawn, unbroken from the wall of the house to the shrubbery beyond, its white surface as smooth and untroubled as a sheet fresh from the laundress. "No mark approaches this window," he said, half to himself, "and none departs from it. The chimney," he glanced up into the black throat of the hearth, "is a full third too narrow to admit a man, even were the fire not customarily kept alight until midnight. We are asked to believe, gentlemen, that a locked room, secured by a single key which never left its owner's bedside, has nevertheless been entered and its contents removed." It was at this juncture that a new figure made himself known to us, a broad, brisk man of perhaps 45, who introduced himself as Inspector Arthur Dalrymple of the County Constabulary, and explained that he had been overtaken by the storm the previous afternoon, while travelling upon business unconnected with Blackthorn Hall, and had been obliged to accept Sir Edmund's hospitality for the night. He took in the scene with the quick, proprietary eye of a man well accustomed to authority, and it was not 3 minutes before he had fixed upon his theory. "Servants, Sir Edmund," said he with the confidence of long habit. "It is always the servants in a house of this kind. Someone in this household possesses a second key, or the knowledge of how the lock may be forced without a mark to show for it. I shall want to speak with every man and woman below stairs before the morning is out." Holmes said nothing to this, but I observed the faint compression of his lips that in him did duty for a smile of a not very charitable character. He turned instead to the desk where the recovered transcript lay open, and I saw Sir Edmund, peering over his shoulder, give a sudden start. "This is not the book, Mr. Holmes. You're certain?" "As certain as a man may be of anything. There was a small brown stain here upon the lower corner of the cover, an old mark of spilled ink, I believe, from some clerk's careless hand many years ago. I have seen it 1,000 times. It is gone." Bell, summoned from his room in some disarray, examined the volume with visible reluctance to accept so extraordinary a conclusion. It appears identical in every other respect, Sir Edmund. The same binding, the same lettering upon the spine. Surely it is possible that—" "It is not the same book," said Sir Edmund, with the flat finality of a man who has spent 30 years upon the bench weighing the difference between certainty and mere probability. While Dalrymple busied himself below stairs with his servants, Holmes conducted an examination of the library that I can only call exhaustive. He knelt before the cold hearth and sifted, with a pair of tweezers drawn from his pocket, through the grey ash that remained from the previous evening's fire, and from among the cinders extracted several minute fragments of a reddish, waxy substance which he wrapped with great care in a twist of paper. He passed next to the carpet before the cabinet, and there, upon hands and knees, discovered a faint rectangular impression pressed into the pile, as though some heavy object, a box or a small chest, had rested upon that spot for a time and been afterward removed. Rising, he examined the inner edge of the cabinet door itself, and drew my attention to a small pale smear along its lower rim. "Beeswax, Watson, or I'm much mistaken. Beeswax upon a cabinet door? Precisely the question I intend to answer." He straightened and stood for a long moment regarding the empty shelf where the packet had lain, his brows drawn together in that particular attitude of concentration I had learned never to interrupt. Then, producing his pocket rule, he measured with great deliberation the depth of the cabinet's interior, and afterward the thickness of the transcript itself, entering both figures into his notebook without offering the smallest explanation. "What have you discovered?" I asked him, when at last he closed the book and returned it to his pocket. He looked at me with something of that dry humour which was, in him, so often the herald of a discovery not yet ripe for disclosure. "A book may occupy a shelf, Watson," said he, "but it may also conceal what formerly occupied the space behind it." I confess I understood him not at all and said as much, but Holmes only shook his head and turned once more to the cabinet as though the empty shelf held for him some eloquence that was as yet denied to me. Chapter 4. An Impossible Exchange. By mid-morning, Inspector Dalrymple had constructed, with the satisfaction of a man laying the final course of a wall, a theory that seemed to him to want nothing further. "It is not so very mysterious, Mr. Holmes. Once one applies a little plain reasoning," said he, as we stood together in the hall. "Someone entered this library before Greeley locked it for the night, and remained concealed within until the household slept. At his leisure, he exchanged the transcript, broke open the packet at his convenience, and made his escape after the door was opened this morning, in the general confusion." "An ingenious reconstruction," said Holmes, "though it requires a hiding-place that does not exist." Dalrymple bristled somewhat at this, but Holmes led him back into the library and demonstrated, with the patient thoroughness of a man determined to leave no reasonable doubt, that no such refuge was to be found. The cupboards beneath the bookshelves were shallow affairs, scarcely deep enough to receive a folio volume, let alone a grown man. The curtains hung close against the panelling, without fold or recess sufficient to conceal so much as a child. The knee-hole of the desk was open on every side, and the space beneath the great leather sofa was, upon examination with a walking-stick, found to be occupied by nothing more sinister than the accumulated dust of some season's neglect. "Then the window," said Dalrymple, not yet ready to relinquish his theory. "A confederate without, perhaps, working the sash from outside with a knife-blade, while our man passed the packet through and made his own way out by the door in the morning bustle." Holmes crossed again to the window and studied the snow beyond with the same close attention I had seen him bestow upon it before. "Observe, Inspector, the character of a fresh fall. It lies here as it lay at dawn, unbroken from the wall of the house to the shrubbery. Had a plank been laid across it, or a rope let down, the surface must show some trace of the disturbance, a compression, a furrow, the mark of a boot at either end. There is nothing. I put it to you that no one has approached this window since the snow ceased to fall, and the snow, as I have had occasion to remark to my friend Watson, cannot be persuaded to hold its tongue. Dalrymple, though visibly nettled, could not gainsay the evidence of his own eyes, and applied himself instead to a fresh course of inquiry among the household, which yielded, before the day was half done, a positively bewildering accumulation of small discoveries. Behind the curtain nearest the hearth was found a military matchbox, unmistakably the property of Colonel Meredith, who admitted with some embarrassment that he had indeed sat smoking in the library after the rest of the household had retired, though he protested he had left well before 11 and had no notion how the box came to be mislaid there. A half-burned sheet of paper drawn from the ashes of the library fire was found upon examination to bear, in several surviving lines, the unmistakable hand of Mr. Bell, though the solicitor, when confronted with it, professed himself entirely at a loss to account for its presence, saying only that he had drafted a great many memoranda in the course of his work upon Sir Edmund's papers, and could not undertake to say what had become of each. Dr. Harcourt, questioned as to Sir Edmund's movements the previous evening, admitted with evident reluctance that he had prepared and administered to his patient a mild sleeping draught before retiring, a precaution, he explained, rendered necessary by the judge's increasing difficulty in sleeping, since the review of the old transcript had begun to prey upon his mind. And Eleanor Vale, when Holmes turned his quiet questioning upon her, confessed, with more colour in her cheek than the admission seemed to warrant, that she had argued with her uncle some days before our arrival, urging him to abandon his intention of reopening so painful and so old a matter, and that the argument had ended, she was ashamed to say, in some heat on both sides. Each fact, taken alone, seemed to point some accusing finger. Taken together, they pointed nowhere at all, or rather everywhere at once, which in the practical business of detection amounts to very much the same result. Dalrymple, to his credit, seemed at last to sense that his wall of plain reasoning was built upon no very solid foundation, and fell into a brooding silence that lasted through luncheon. Holmes, for his part, regarded the accumulating clues with a scepticism that grew, if anything, more pronounced with each fresh discovery. I remarked upon it as we walked together in the long gallery that afternoon, the snow still falling steadily beyond the windows. "You do not seem greatly moved by the Colonel's matchbox, nor by Bell's memorandum," I observed. "I am moved by them precisely to the degree that they deserve, Watson, which is to say, very little. Consider the singular convenience of it all. A matchbox that identifies its owner as plainly as a calling card. A sheet of paper, half burned, yet burned with such discretion as to leave the guilty hand legible. These are not the traces a careful man leaves behind him by accident. They are the traces a clever man leaves behind him by design, when he wishes our attention drawn toward his neighbour and away from himself. Then you believe one of these clues to be a deliberate plant? I believe it premature to say which, or indeed whether more than one. But I would have you do something for me before the light fails. Note down, if you will, the position of every chair in this library as it now stands, the quantity of coal remaining in the scuttle beside the hearth, and the precise height, in inches, of each shelf within the brass-mounted cabinet." I confess I stared at him. "Holmes, I can see no possible connection between the height of a shelf and the theft of a legal document." "Very likely you cannot," said he, with a patience that held, I thought, a certain private amusement. "And I will own that the connection is not yet apparent even to myself in every particular. But I have found, in the long course of my experience, that the gravest danger in an affair which presents itself as impossible lies not in any occult cunning on the part of the criminal, but in a far more ordinary failing on the part of the observer. And what failing is that? That he accepts without proof an impossible premise, and having accepted it, no longer troubles to examine the ground beneath his feet." He turned from the window, his face in the fading light, unusually grave. "Measure your chairs, Watson. I promise you the exercise is not so idle as it appears." Chapter 5. What the Eye Remembers. The measurements I had taken at Holmes's direction occupied a page of my notebook by the time we sat down to dinner, and I confess I regarded the exercise still with some private scepticism, though long acquaintance with my friend's methods had taught me better than to say so aloud. It was not until the following morning, when Holmes began a fresh series of interviews with the household, that I began to perceive the shape of the design toward which he was working. He conducted these interviews, I noticed, in a manner altogether different from that of Inspector Dalrymple, who continued to press each witness upon the question of motive, and to receive, in consequence, only the guarded and self-protective answers that such questions naturally invite. Holmes asked scarcely anything of motive at all. His questions turned instead, and with a persistence that seemed almost wearisome, upon the single matter of what each person had seen. Colonel Meredith, examined first, proved a witness of the military sort, precise as to fact, impatient of speculation. I passed the library door a few minutes before 11, Mr. Holmes, on my way up to bed. There was light beneath it still, and I heard, or thought I heard, someone moving within. I did not go in. I'd already bid the household good night, and saw no occasion to intrude upon Sir Edmund's privacy. Dr. Harcourt, questioned next, recalled a different portion of the evening. Sir Edmund carried the transcript up to his own room after dinner. I saw him do it myself, for I accompanied him part way up the stair, being concerned for his heart. He kept it with him above 20 minutes, I should think, before he returned it to the library and placed it once more in the cabinet. Eleanor Vale, for her part, remembered the hour by a different measure entirely. I was in the conservatory a little before 11, Mr. Holmes, arranging some flowers for the morning, when I heard the library clock strike the hour quite distinctly. Bell recalled, when his turn came, the particular moment of the room's securing. I was in the hall when Greeley locked the library, and I saw him close the cabinet door myself not 5 minutes before. And the Reverend Price, last of the household to be questioned, offered a detail that struck me, even as he spoke it, as curiously specific. I looked into the library earlier in the evening, Mr. Holmes, shortly after dinner, I should say, before the port had gone round a second time, and I recall quite plainly that the transcript lay upon the desk, not upright in the cabinet, but flat, as though someone had but lately set it down. Holmes received each of these accounts with the same close and silent attention, entering nothing in his notebook so far as I could see, beyond a word or two at the close of each interview. It was only when the last had withdrawn that he turned to me with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "You have observed, Watson, how readily a witness will furnish the hour of an event by the striking of a clock he has not himself examined." I had not considered it in those terms, no. Then consider it now. There are in this house no fewer than 3 clocks whose testimony we may usefully compare with that of our human witnesses. The library clock, as I determined this morning by comparison with my own watch, runs some 7 minutes slow. The clock in the hall keeps admirable time. The servant's clock in the kitchen, upon the other hand, runs fully 12 minutes fast. He paused, allowing the figures their proper weight. These discrepancies would be of no earthly consequence, were it not that our witnesses have been so obliging as to fix their movements by reference to one clock or another, without troubling to specify which. You believe someone has claimed to hear a striking they could not, in fact, have heard. I believe it more than probable Miss Vale places herself in the conservatory at 11 by the library clock striking. Yet the conservatory lies at the farther end of the house, beyond 2 closed doors, and I have satisfied myself this very morning, by standing in that same conservatory while Watson struck the library clock's chime by hand, that no sound from that quarter reaches it with any clarity whatever. A silvery ghost of a chime, Watson, at best. Nothing a person occupied with flowers would be likely to remark, let alone number with confidence. I own that this observation gave me some pause, for it seemed to point a finger toward Eleanor Vale that I was reluctant, on so slight a matter as the carrying power of a clock's chime, to credit. But Holmes was not yet finished. There is a second matter, smaller still, yet, I think, not less significant. In the course of these interviews, one member of this household referred twice to the transcript as the blue volume. though you will have observed for yourself, Watson, that its binding shows, under the ordinary light of a gas jet, as dark a green as any lawyer's calf ever was dyed. I had not remarked the colour particularly. I had, and I remarked also that the same leather, viewed beneath the stronger and whiter light of the electric lamp upon Sir Edmund's writing desk in his upstairs study, takes on a distinctly bluish cast, a common enough effect of such illumination upon certain dyes, and one I have had occasion to note before in quite another connection. The inference, I think, is not a difficult one to draw, that the speaker has seen the transcript beneath that particular lamp, and more recently than they have admitted. Precisely so. He rose and stood for a moment gazing out upon the whitened lawn, his hands clasped behind him in that attitude of reflection I knew so well. I do not yet say whom I suspect, Watson, for a single slip of memory, however suggestive, is not proof, and I have been wrong before in matters that seemed a good deal more certain than this. But I would ask you a question, and I would have you answer it honestly, without regard to what you imagine I wish to hear. Which is the more reliable witness, the memory of a statement, or the memory of a colour? I considered the matter for some moments before replying. The statement, I should think. A man may misjudge a colour in poor light, or from a distance, far more readily than he can invent, from nothing, the substance of what was said to him. Holmes smiled, though there was little of mirth in it. That is precisely why testimony is so frequently dangerous, my dear fellow. We trust the very faculty least deserving of our trust, and distrust the one that would serve us best. For a man will labour, consciously or not, to make his words agree with what he believes to be expected of him, while his eye, being a duller and more honest servant, too often betrays him without his knowledge. He said no more upon the subject that evening, but I observed that he passed a considerable time before the fire with his pipe, and that whatever conclusion he had begun to draw, he kept it, for the present, entirely to himself. Chapter 6. The Silent Agreement. The second day of our confinement at Blackthorn Hall brought with it no relief from the weather, but it brought in its place a slow and reluctant unfolding of the household's private history, a history which I began to perceive as fragment joined to fragment, was very much older and very much darker than the theft of a single document could account for. It was Colonel Meredith who broke first, and broke, I think, less from any pressure Holmes had applied than from the simple weight of holding a secret through 2 sleepless nights. He came to Holmes after breakfast, drew him aside into the gun-room, and there, with the bluff discomfort of a soldier unaccustomed to confession, admitted that he had known Nathaniel Crowe personally, and had known him, moreover, as a benefactor. My brother Mr. Holmes, my late brother Charles, came near to ruin some years before the Crowe affair, through certain speculations he had no business making. Crowe learned of it, and quietly saw the matter settled before it could reach the newspapers or the courts. I owed him a debt I never had occasion to repay, for he was tried and convicted before I could so much as offer my thanks. I sat upon that jury, sir, and I will confess to you now, what I have confessed to no living soul, that I harboured doubts of Fenwick's evidence even as I returned my verdict, and have carried those doubts, like a stone in my boot, for 15 years. Dr. Harcourt's confession followed within the hour, offered with less reluctance but no less significance. Arthur Fenwick, it transpired, had for some years before the trial numbered among the doctor's own patients, a nervous dyspeptic man by Harcourt's account, given to fits of anxiety that no medicine of his could wholly relieve. I attended him through the weeks before the trial, Mr. Holmes, and I will say only this, that a man so shaken in his nerves might be led toward a great many statements he would not, in a calmer hour, have thought to make. From Eleanor Vale came a confidence of a different order. Her father, Sir Edmund's younger brother, had died some years before, but not before confiding to his daughter, in the plain language of a dying man with nothing left to lose, his private conviction that Nathaniel Crowe had been innocent of the charge that ruined him. He never spoke of it publicly, Mr. Holmes, for my uncle's sake, and for the honour of the family name, but he believed it to the end, and I have believed it, on his word, ever since. And Bell, questioned last, admitted with evident discomfort that his own legal firm had once represented a group of investors ruined in the collapse that followed Crow's conviction, men who had lost a great deal in the general panic and who had, in the years since, come to regard the verdict with a bitterness that time had done little to soften. I confess that as these several histories accumulated before us, I began to despair of ever disentangling one from another, so thoroughly did they seem to implicate the whole of the household at once. But Holmes, when I said as much to him that afternoon, shook his head with the particular impatience he reserved for what he considered my slower moments. "You mistake the pattern for a tangle, Watson, when it is in truth the reverse. Consider what we have learned. Not one soul in this house profited by Crow's conviction, save perhaps the prosecution that secured it, and yet not one soul, until this very week, troubled to voice a doubt that each, in his own fashion, appears to have privately entertained. There was, I begin to suspect, no conspiracy formed in any room, no bargain struck, no money passed from hand to hand. There was something a good deal quieter and a good deal more damning, a silent agreement, if you will, among a company of otherwise honest men, each of whom found it more convenient to look away from a question than to ask it aloud. And that agreement held for 15 years, until Sir Edmund himself broke it by opening the Transcript once more. Just so, which brings us, I think, to the true shape of the crime before us. He drew from his pocket the notebook in which he had, over the preceding days, entered his several measurements, and consulted it now with evident purpose. I have reason to believe, Watson, that the Transcript was not exchanged during the night at all, but before ever the library was locked. But Sir Edmund examined the volume himself that very evening before it was returned to the cabinet. He examined a volume certainly. Whether it was the same volume he had studied that morning is quite another question. Consider, Doctor, Harcourt tells us the judge carried the Transcript to his own room after dinner and kept it above 20 minutes before restoring it to the cabinet. 20 minutes, Watson, is not a great while, but it is time enough, in practised hands, for an exchange to be effected, provided the substitute has been prepared beforehand and lies ready to hand. I turn this notion over with growing unease. You mean that the book Greeley locked into the cabinet at 11 was already the false one? That no theft occurred within the room at all that night, but only the appearance of one? I mean precisely that. Someone has taken a great deal of trouble to persuade this household that the substitution occurred after the door was locked, when in fact it had already been accomplished before. As for the clerk's notes, he frowned, and I saw that here at least his reconstruction had not yet closed upon its object. Their disappearance remains as yet unaccounted for. It was in pursuit of this last question that Holmes led me, an hour later, into the conservatory, a glass-walled chamber at the rear of the house, fragrant even in winter with the green, earthy smell of Sir Edmund's potted palms. Behind a row of these, in a corner the housemaids had evidently neglected, Holmes discovered a fine scattering of black fibres, such as might be shed from the lining of a document case, and beneath a marble-topped table nearby, upon its underside where no casual glance would find it, a small smear of red sealing wax. Someone has opened a sealed packet in this room, Watson, and taken pains that the opening should not be observed. But the conservatory door was locked throughout the evening. Sir Edmund said as much himself. He said it was believed to be locked, Holmes corrected gently, turning the smear of wax toward the grey light from the glass roof above. I begin to suspect, my dear fellow, that we are dealing not with one set of concealed movements in this house, but with two, and whether the hands that made them work together or entirely apart is a question I am not yet in a position to answer. Chapter 7. The Confession in the Snow. On the third morning of our confinement, I woke to find the wind fallen and a pale, uncertain sun struggling through the clouds above the moor, the first sign, faint as it was, that the storm had begun at last to spend itself. I had scarcely dressed, however, before a fresh commotion below stairs announced that Blackthorn Hall had not yet done with alarms. Greeley was missing. His bed, I was told, had not been slept in. His heavy coat and his boots were gone from the passage where they were customarily kept. Sir Edmund, roused from his own room in considerable agitation, at once organised a search of the grounds, and it was Colonel Meredith, tramping out through the drifts with the brisk competence of old campaigning, who at length discovered the old butler some several hundred yards from the house, seated upon an overturned barrow beside an abandoned gardener's shed, exhausted, half frozen, but otherwise unharmed. We brought him in and warmed him before the kitchen fire, and it was there, before Dalrymple could so much as frame his first question, that Greeley made his confession. "I did it, sir," said he, his old hands trembling about a cup of hot spirits that Dr. Harcourt had pressed upon him. "I exchanged the transcript. I could bear the weight of it no longer, and thought to end it by confessing before you found the proof yourselves." The room fell silent, and Greeley, encouraged perhaps by that silence, continued in a voice that gathered steadiness as he went on. "Mr. Crowe was kind to my family, Mr. Holmes, in a manner few gentlemen would trouble themselves to be kind to a servant's people. My sister's husband was ruined in the panic that followed the trial, and Mr. Crowe, though he stood accused himself and had every reason to think only of his own affairs, wrote to certain friends on my brother-in-law's behalf, and saved him from the debtor's prison. I never forgot it. When Sir Edmund began his review of the old papers, I thought, God forgive me, that I might set the wrong a little to rights. I meant to replace the transcript with one that told the truth of the matter, and afterward to see that the original forged pages were discovered, so that the injustice might come to light." "And the clerk's notes?" asked Dalrymple, who had by now recovered sufficiently from his surprise to press the advantage. "You took those also?" "I took them, sir, and hid them yonder in the shed, meaning to destroy them once I was certain my purpose was accomplished." The packet was found precisely where he indicated, and Dalrymple, examining it with the satisfaction of a man whose original theory has been vindicated by the plainest possible means, declared the matter substantially closed. Greeley possessed, by virtue of 30 years' service, an intimate knowledge of every lock in the house. His opportunity was beyond question, his motive both credible and, in its way, affecting. Even Sir Edmund, though visibly shaken to learn that so trusted a servant had deceived him, seemed inclined to accept the confession as the true and final account of the matter. Holmes alone withheld his assent. He said nothing to contradict the confession before the assembled household, but drew me aside as the old butler was helped away to his room, and led me, without a word of explanation, to examine the boots Greeley had worn upon his flight into the snow. "Observe the soles, Watson." I did as he bade me, and saw, packed into the crevices of the leather, a quantity of hardened snow mixed with a scattering of pale gravel. I see nothing remarkable in it. Gravel is common enough about any country house. It is common enough, certainly, but not everywhere alike. I walked the whole distance from this door to the shed not an hour since, and I give you my word, Watson, that the ground between lies under snow from the house wall to the very threshold of that ruin, without so much as a pebble showing through. There is, however, gravel of precisely this pale character beneath the covered carriage entrance at the east side of the house. Gravel laid down, I should judge, some years ago, to spare the horse's hoofs from the mud. You mean he did not walk directly from the house to the shed? I mean that his boots have touched ground he tells us he never crossed. Holmes turned next to the recovered packet, which lay upon the hall table awaiting Dalrymple's further attention, and lifted it with careful fingers. Consider also this. Greeley claims to have carried the packet through the storm concealed beneath a thin coat, and to have kept it hidden in an unheated shed these 2 nights past. Feel the paper, Watson. I did so, and found it, to my considerable surprise, entirely dry, without the faintest trace of the damp that must, I should have thought, inevitably penetrate so slight a shelter in weather such as we had endured. And here, Holmes continued, indicating the broken wax that had once secured the packet's flap, is a seal cut cleanly through with a single stroke of some sharp blade. A surgeon's neatness, Watson, or a solicitor's, but scarcely the work of hands so twisted with age and rheumatism as our friend Greeley's. I have watched him at table these 3 evenings past, and I do not believe he could perform so precise a cut with a knife, new sharpened and both hands steady, let alone in the dark, in haste, and in the cold. I confess that as he set out these several points one by one, my confidence in the confession we had just heard began to waver considerably. Then you believe he has confessed to a crime he did not commit? I believe, said Holmes slowly, that Greeley has confessed to protect someone he loves better than he loves his own liberty, and that whoever contrived the true theft has been clever enough or ruthless enough to let him do it. He stood a moment in silence, turning the dry, unweathered packet over in his hands, his face graver than I had yet seen it in the course of that inquiry. An innocent man may confess for many reasons, Watson. Fear, confusion, misplaced loyalty. A guilty man, upon the other hand, usually prefers that someone else should. Then what do you propose to do? Dalrymple is already satisfied, and Sir Edmund seems disposed to let the matter rest. I propose to do nothing for the present beyond what I have already done, said Holmes, restoring the packet to the table with the same careful attention with which he had lifted it. A confession freely offered is a difficult thing to dislodge with mere suspicion, however well-founded. I must have proof, Watson, of a kind that even the inspector cannot argue away, and I begin to believe that the means of furnishing it lies not here, but somewhere above our heads, in a room we have not yet troubled to search. Chapter 8. The Second Transcript. Whatever doubts Holmes had confided to me alone, they made no headway against the general conviction of the household, which settled, over the course of that day, into a comfortable certainty that the mystery of Blackthorn Hall was resolved. Dalrymple spoke openly at luncheon of the formalities attending Greeley's removal once the road should open, and even Sir Edmund, though his manner remained troubled, seemed to have accepted the confession as the melancholy but final chapter of the affair. It was Bell who disturbed this settled conclusion, and disturbed it, moreover, quite by accident. He came upon Holmes and myself in the long gallery a little before tea, his face flushed with a discovery that seemed to have driven from his mind, for the moment, his customary reserve. "Mr. Holmes, you must come at once. I have found something in Sir Edmund's room that I cannot in the least account for." We followed him up the staircase to the judge's bedchamber, where, in an old document chest thrust half beneath the window-seat, and evidently long unused, Bell had discovered a second copy of the Crow trial transcript. Outwardly, so like the first that I might myself have mistaken one for the other, had they not now lain side by side upon the coverlet. Sir Edmund, summoned to examine it, turned at once to the disputed passage in Fenwick's testimony, and I saw the colour rise in his gaunt cheeks as he read. "This is the transcript as I remember it, Mr. Holmes. The additional sentences, the accusations of threats, they are simply not here. This is the true record of what was said in my court." Dalrymple, arriving upon the commotion, required scarcely a moment to fit this new fact into the frame of his existing theory. "It is plain enough, Sir Edmund. Greeley must have concealed the authentic volume here, in your own room, against the day he could safely produce it, while he placed the false transcript in the library cabinet for us to discover in its stead. The whole scheme hangs together very neatly now." To my considerable surprise, Holmes offered no immediate contradiction. He examined the newly discovered volume with his usual thoroughness, compared it once, briefly, with the book already in Sir Edmund's possession, and then, turning to Dalrymple with an expression I could not quite read, congratulated him upon a conclusion so satisfactorily reached. I confess that as we withdrew from the room some while later, I taxed him rather sharply with this apparent capitulation. "You cannot mean that you accept Dalrymple's explanation, not after all you have shown me this morning." "I have said nothing that commits me to any such belief," Holmes replied, with a composure that did little to allay my irritation. I have only declined for the present to argue with a man who is enjoying his triumph. There is a time for demonstration, Watson, and a time for patience, and I have found that the two are rarely well combined before an audience already persuaded of its own correctness. It was not until that evening, when the household had settled to its several occupations and the corridors lay quiet under the last grey light of the storm's retreat, that Holmes drew me once more, and this time in secret, up the back stair to Sir Edmund's room. He carried with him a small dark lantern and his glass, and set to work at once comparing the two transcripts, page by page beneath its narrow beam. For a long while I could discern nothing in his examination beyond the patient turning of the leaves. Then he gave a low exclamation and beckoned me closer. "Observe this, Watson, the official court stamp, embossed upon every page by the clerk's own press at the time of transcription." He held one leaf to the lantern's light, tilting it so that the raised impression of the seal caught the glow along its edges. You will see that upon the authentic pages the impression rises outward from the printed face of the paper, the natural consequence of a press applied from behind in the ordinary manner. But observe these pages. He turned several leaves in swift succession, each bearing upon its margin the disputed additions to Fenwick's testimony. Where the impression falls the opposite way, the stamp has been applied from the wrong side of the sheet. I bent to examine it myself and saw, faint but unmistakable once my attention had been directed to it, the small but telling reversal he described. "These are not genuine court pages at all," said Holmes. "They are counterfeits, Watson, manufactured with very great skill and stamped, in the maker's haste or ignorance, from the wrong face of the paper." "Then the transcript in the library cabinet is the forgery, precisely as Sir Edmund believed from the first. So I should have said myself an hour ago." Holmes turned now to the second volume, the one but lately discovered in the document chest, and began the same patient examination of its pages. His expression as he proceeded grew steadily graver. "But observe now, Watson, this volume, the one we are asked to accept as the true and uncorrupted record." He held a leaf toward me, and I saw, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, the same telling reversal upon several of its pages also, scattered among passages that appeared, upon their face, entirely innocent and undisputed. "Both are false," I said slowly. "Both are false in part, which is a very different and a very much more dangerous thing than either being false entire. Someone has taken the single authentic transcript of that old trial, Watson, and divided it, section from section, page from page, constructing from its fragments two composite volumes, each plausible, each internally consistent, and each, by design, contradicting the other upon precisely the point that matters most. But to what conceivable purpose? A forger commonly wishes his fraud to be believed, not to leave a rival fraud standing beside it to invite comparison. "Unless," said Holmes, and here his voice took on that low, deliberate quality I had learned to associate with the final unfolding of a long-suspected truth. His purpose was never to make either version believed, but to render it forever impossible to say with certainty which version was true. A single forgery once detected condemns itself. Two forgeries, standing in contradiction, condemn nothing. They merely bury the truth beneath a question that no examination, however skillful, can now resolve, since the only witness capable of settling it beyond dispute has already vanished from this house. The clerk's notes. The clerk's notes, Holmes agreed, closing the volume before him with a quiet final motion. Which is why, Watson, their recovery has become, since this very hour, a matter of considerably greater urgency than I had supposed this morning. Tomorrow, I think, we shall conduct the trial of Nathaniel Crowe once again, though this time I mean to see that the evidence is not permitted to rearrange itself before our eyes. Chapter 9. Holmes reconstructs the night. The library was warmer than I had yet known it when we assembled there the following morning, for Sir Edmund had ordered the fire built high, as though its blaze might somehow dispel the chill that had settled upon the house since Greeley's confession. The household gathered at Holmes's request, Sir Edmund in his accustomed chair by the hearth, Eleanor at his side, Colonel Meredith standing stiffly near the window, Dr. Harcourt and Reverend Price upon the sofa, Bell seated a little apart at the desk, and Dalrymple, notebook in hand, occupying the chair nearest the door, as though he half expected to require it for some official purpose before the interview was concluded. Holmes stood before the cabinet, the two composite transcripts laid side by side upon its top, and began, as was his custom, not with the name of the guilty, but with the plain sequence of events. "I wish first to establish," said he, "that no theft occurred in this room upon the night we have all supposed. The transcript was not exchanged after Greeley turned the key at 11 o'clock. It was exchanged before, during the 20 minutes in which Sir Edmund carried the volume to his own study after dinner, and it was a composite transcript prepared beforehand that he unknowingly returned to this cabinet with his own hand." Sir Edmund's face, already pale, grew paler still. "You're telling me I have been deceived in my own house, under my own eye. I am telling you that the deception was designed with precisely that possibility in view, and I am able to fix the moment of its execution by a single detail which one member of this household let fall, without, I believe, the smallest notion of its significance." Holmes turned toward Eleanor Vale, and though his voice remained gentle, I saw her hands tighten upon the arm of her uncle's chair. "Miss Vale, you described the transcript to me upon my first inquiry as blue in colour, yet its binding, as anyone may see, shows dark green beneath the light of this room. There is one place in this house, and one only, where that leather takes on a bluish cast to the eye, beneath the electric lamp upon your uncle's writing desk upstairs in his private study. You told me you had not entered that room upon the evening in question. I put it to you now that you had." Eleanor's composure, which I had admired through 3 days of trial, wavered at last. "I brought my uncle his medicine, Mr. Holmes, no more than that. I saw the book lying upon his desk, and I confess I did not think to mention it, for it seemed a matter of no consequence. It was, I think, a matter of considerable consequence, though not, I believe, through any fault of your own." Holmes's gaze moved on and came to rest at last upon the solicitor at the desk. "The true architect of this deception, Mr. Bell, was yourself." Bell didn't start, nor exclaim, nor protest, as I confess I had half expected. He sat very still, his pale face turned toward the fire, and said nothing at all, which seemed to me in its way more damning than any denial could have been. "Your father," Holmes continued, "served as junior counsel at the trial of Nathaniel Crowe. In the course of his duties he discovered, I believe, that certain portions of Fenwick's testimony had been privately amended after they were delivered in court, a fact which, had it come to light, must have destroyed both the conviction and the reputation of every man who had by silence allowed it to stand. Your father chose silence himself and prospered by it, as did his firm in the settling of the ruined investors' claims that followed. You discovered the truth, I think, among his papers after his death, and lived with the knowledge until Sir Edmund's intended review threatened to bring it, after 15 years, into the light." "You cannot know this," said Bell at last, though the protest carried little conviction. "I can, and I will show you how. You constructed from the single genuine transcript 2 composite volumes, one preserving the official history entire, the other omitting the disputed testimony, so that whichever way Sir Edmund's suspicions turned, a contradiction would stand ready to meet him, and no examination, however careful, could resolve which volume spoke the truth. The clerk's original notes alone could settle the question beyond dispute, and those you remove from this cabinet by a very simple deception, a duplicate, empty packet, substituted while the true one was carried away, concealed within the transcript you yourself were, that same evening, arranging among Sir Edmund's papers. The rectangular mark I found pressed into this carpet came from the document chest you set down here, while you effected the exchange. The beeswax upon the cabinet door came from a length of waxed thread, with which you steadied the false packet upright at the rear of the shelf, that it might not betray its lightness to a casual hand. "And Greeley?" asked Sir Edmund in a voice I scarcely recognised for his own. "Greeley discovered some part of your scheme, Mr. Bell, and mistook its meaning entirely. He had seen Miss Vale enter your study that evening, and believed her, in his loyal and mistaken heart, to be somehow implicated. You persuaded him, I think without great difficulty, that exposure of the truth must ruin the family he had served for 30 years, and he offered you, in his devotion, the one thing that might avert it, his own liberty in place of hers. You drove him part way to the shed in your own trap, by the covered entrance where the gravel lies beneath the snow, that the poor old man might survive a walk his years could scarcely have endured entire." Bell said nothing, but his silence, by now, was answer enough for every soul in that room. "Your final error, Mr. Bell, was one of simple arithmetic," Holmes went on, more quietly now. "You told Inspector Dalrymple that you heard the library clock strike 11 while standing in the hall. But that clock, as I've proved to my own satisfaction, cannot be heard with any clarity beyond this room's own walls. You were not in the hall at that hour. You were in the conservatory cutting open the stolen packet with a blade whose edge still carries, I do not doubt, traces of the same red sealing wax I found upon the underside of the table there, and which a very little searching of your coat, I think, will confirm upon your penknife." Dalrymple, recovering at last from his astonishment, rose and crossed to the desk, and I saw Bell, when the inspector's hand fell upon his shoulder, offer no resistance whatsoever, as though some long and exhausting struggle had at last and almost with relief come to its end. "I did not create the wrong that was done to Crow, Mr. Holmes," said he at last, very low. "I only inherited it, and chose, God help me, to bury it deeper rather than dig it out. That," said Holmes, not unkindly, "is very often how the gravest injustices are made to endure." Chapter 10. When the roads open. By the following morning the storm had passed entirely, and I woke to a stillness so complete that for a moment I lay uncertain what had changed, until I understood that it was the absence, after 3 days, of wind against the casement. When I drew back the curtain, the moor lay spread beneath a sky of pale and washed blue, the snow upon it catching the early sun with a brightness that made the eyes ache after so long a darkness, and already, far off upon the road, I could make out the small dark figures of men from the village, come with spades and shovels to open the way once more to the world. Inspector Dalrymple lost no time in the formalities his profession required of him. Bell was taken into custody before breakfast was fairly cleared away, charged, as Dalrymple gravely informed us, with theft, forgery, obstruction of justice, and the attempted destruction of evidence material to a matter of public record. He went with a quietness that I found, in its way, more affecting than any outward show of remorse could have been. A man, it seemed to me, less defeated by his capture than relieved of a burden he had carried a long while alone. Greeley, by contrast, was released within the hour, and I confess it did my heart good to see the colour return by degrees to the old butler's face, as Sir Edmund himself came to assure him, with a warmth I had not before seen the judge display, that no shadow of blame attached to him beyond an old man's misplaced and generous loyalty. "You would have given your liberty for a girl who is no kin to you, Greeley," said Sir Edmund, "believing her guilty of a crime she never committed. I do not know that I have deserved such service in 30 years, but I am grateful for it now." "She is kin enough to me, sir," the old man answered simply, "having grown up under this roof since she was a child in short frocks. I'd not have seen her taken, whatever the truth of it." Sir Edmund spent the greater part of that morning closeted with Holmes in the library, and it was there, before we took our leave, that he laid out to us his resolve concerning the papers now, at such cost recovered and understood. "I shall submit both composite transcripts to the Lord Chancellor, Mr. Holmes, together with the clerk's original notes, and whatever account of your reconstruction you're willing to set down in writing." The notes proved beyond dispute that Fenwick's testimony was altered, after it left his lips in my own court. Whether by his own hand or another's is a question I fear may never now be answered with certainty, And Crowe himself, I asked. Do you believe him innocent? Sir Edmund was a long while answering, and when he did, it was with the careful, measured honesty of a man who had spent a lifetime weighing exactly such questions from the bench. I cannot say with certainty that he was innocent, Dr. Watson. What I can say, and what I mean to say to the Lord Chancellor in the plainest terms I can command, is that the process which condemned him was not honest, whatever the truth of the matter it was meant to establish. A man may be guilty, and yet be convicted upon evidence that has been corrupted. The two things are not the same, though the law, in its proper working, requires that we never confuse them. Reputation, said Holmes, in that dry reflective tone he reserved for the closing of a case rather than its unravelling, is merely evidence supplied by society concerning itself, Sir Edmund, and it deserves, I think, precisely the same suspicion we would extend to any other testimony, no more and no less. Yours has survived this scrutiny. Not every reputation touched by this business will do so, and I do not think you should shrink from that consequence merely because it is uncomfortable. I had rather have the truth uncomfortable than the falsehood at ease, said Sir Edmund, with something of his old judicial firmness returning to his voice, and I thank you, Mr. Holmes, for having compelled me to the choice. Eleanor Vale came to us as our trap was brought round to the door, the horses stamping and blowing in the cold, sharp air, their breath rising like small clouds against the brightness of the snow. I do not know how to thank you, Mr. Holmes, said she, for preventing poor Greeley from sacrificing himself upon my account. I fear I should never have forgiven myself, had matters gone as he intended. You need thank no one but your own honesty, Miss Vale, Holmes replied, with a courtesy I had not always seen him extend so readily. You told me the truth of a small matter when it would have been very easy to say nothing at all, and it was that truth, small as it seemed to you, which opened the whole of the deception to examination. We took our leave shortly after, and as the trap carried us down the long drive and out upon the road, now cleared toward the village, I turned for a last look at Blackthorn Hall, its grey stone softened by the snow that yet lay heavy upon its roofs, and thought how strange it was that so quiet and respectable a house should have concealed, for so many years, a wrong that none within it had ever quite found the courage to name aloud. You are pensive, Watson, Holmes remarked, as the house fell behind us, and the open moor, white and silent and touched now with a gold, October light, I can only call October in memory, though the calendar named it otherwise, spread out on every side. I was thinking, I said, that the whole affair seemed impossible only because we had each of us accepted certain things without troubling to prove them. That the book in the cabinet was the book we'd seen before. That the packet, once locked away, remained within the room throughout the night. That a man's confession, freely given, must needs identify the guilty party. 3 assumptions, said Holmes, and every one of them false, though each seemed at the moment it was made entirely reasonable. That, my dear Watson, is the peculiar danger of the reasonable assumption. It does not announce itself as an assumption at all, but wears always the comfortable dress of an established fact. I have set down this account, as I have set down so many others, in the conviction that my readers will find in it something more than the mere mechanics of a clever crime unravelled. For it seemed to me, reflecting upon the matter in the weeks that followed, that the great crimes of this world are not always accomplished by violence, nor even by any extraordinary cunning on the criminal's part. Sometimes they are accomplished by something a great deal simpler and a great deal more common than either, by the willingness of respectable people in a respectable house to see precisely what they have been prepared, by long habit and comfortable silence, to expect to see. And in the case of the replaced trial transcript, as in so many others before it, Sherlock Holmes had once again demonstrated, to my lasting admiration, that a mind disciplined to observe without assumption might yet recover, even after 15 years of silence, something very near to the truth.